They weren't just movies, they were landmines. Films so bold, so unflinching, they didn't just spark arguments. They got locked away, pulled from shelves, or outright banished from British screens. Censors called them dangerous, councils called them corrupting, and critics. They couldn't stop talking about them. But why did these stories hit such a nerve? And what happens to a film's legacy when it's taken away from the audience that made it the famous in the first place? Let's rewind to find out. A Clockwork Orange 1971. Picture the early 70s, Britain's in turmoil. Youth unrest is boiling over. Crime headlines are screaming from every paper. And the generation gap feels like a chasm. Then Stanley Kubrick drops A Clockwork Orange, a dystopian nightmare wrapped in surreal costumes, strange slang, and a disturbing portrait of gang violence. Beneath its style was a razor-sharp warning about the state's power to strip away free will and the cost of controlling human choice. But once it hit UK cinemas, the fiction started bleeding into the news. Tabloids ran stories linking vandalism, assaults, and intimidation to the film's style and language. Were those connections real, or just moral panic looking for a target? In the court of public opinion, the verdict was already in. The movie was dangerous. Kubrick didn't wait for the censors to make a move. After months of relentless press pressure and even death threats aimed at his family, he made the unprecedented choice to pull his own film from UK circulation. For nearly 3 decades, the only way to watch it legally was to leave the country, or get your hands on a fuzzy imported tape passed around like contraband. By the time A Clockwork Orange finally returned to British screens in 2000, it was more than a movie. It was a relic from a wilder era, frozen in infamy, with a reputation that had grown far beyond its frames. Did removing it protect the public from dangerous influence? Or did it crown the film with an untouchable mythos that made it even more irresistible? The truth depends on how you see censorship, as a safeguard, or as the best marketing campaign a controversial film could ever hope for. The Devils, 1971. Ken Russell didn't do subtle. When he tackled the 17th century scandal in the French city of Loudun for The Devils, he went all in. Grand, operatic visuals, towering sets, and a relentless pace that dared you to look away. Based loosely on real events, it's less a straightforward history lesson and more a scorching indictment of corruption and paranoia among those in power. British censors were horrified. They saw what they called excessive brutality, an imagery they feared would shock audiences past the point of art. Whole sequences were hacked out for the UK release, but even in its trimmed state, the film provoked outrage. Local councils didn't just object, some flat-out banned it in their regions, cutting off screenings entirely. And yet, like so many controversial films before it, restriction only made it more desirable. Whispers spread among film fans about what was in the missing scenes. Collectors traded grainy, imported copies like sacred relics. The banned material became a kind of cinematic treasure map. Everyone wanted to find it, even if they didn't know exactly what it contained. Over the decades, critics have returned to The Devils with fresh eyes, hailing it as one of Russell's most daring works. A fearless exploration of mass hysteria, political manipulation, and the dangers of blind faith. But the full uncut version has still never been officially released in Britain. That's the lasting irony. The more authorities tried to bury The Devils, the more people were willing to dig. And with every retelling, every whispered account of what's really in it, the legend grows, proving once again that the most effective marketing for a bold film might just be to forbid it. Straw Dogs, 1971. Sam Peckinpah may have been an American filmmaker, but Straw Dogs is steeped in the uneasy stillness of rural Cornwall. Dustin Hoffman plays David Sumner, a soft-spoken outsider looking for peace in a quiet village with his wife. But what begins as a tentative attempt to fit in unravels into hostility, resentment, and, eventually, an eruption of violence. Beneath the surface, it's a study of simmering social tension, how boundaries, once crossed, can never be repaired. It was those bursts of brutality, though, that made Straw Dogs one of the most controversial British releases of its time. The UK's home video boom in the 1980s came with intense scrutiny over harmful content, and Straw Dogs landed squarely in the firing line. For years, it couldn't be legally released on VHS without cuts. Even when edits were made, the debate never stopped. Was this a condemnation of violence, or a provocation designed to make audiences complicit. The ban only fed its reputation. Film buffs whispered about the missing footage, passing around imported copies, and arguing endlessly over its intent. When the uncut version finally reappeared decades later, the conversation shifted. A new generation, less shocked by the on-screen violence, looked past the notoriety and focused on its psychology, the questions it asks about masculinity, fear, and the instinct to defend one's home. Yet even now, Straw Dogs carries the weight of its history. It's one of those rare films judged as much for the storm it caused as for what's actually in the frame. And that's its legacy, proof that the cultural conversation a movie sparks can outlive the movie itself, echoing long after the credits have rolled. Scum, 1979. Few British films have ever hit as hard, or as directly as Scum. Set inside a violent borstal, Alan Clarke's drama began life as a BBC television production. But when executives saw the finished cut, they balked. Too violent, too raw, too unflinching in its portrait of a system that seemed built to break young offenders rather than rehabilitate them. The BBC locked it away, refusing to air it. Clarke didn't retreat. He doubled down. Taking the same script, he remade Scum as a feature film, only this time without the restrictions of television. The result was even harsher, a relentless march through a world of institutional brutality, dominance, and survival of the fittest. The violence wasn't stylized or cinematic. It was blunt, ugly, and impossible to ignore. The British Board of Film Censors refused to classify it, effectively banning it from UK cinemas. That move only amplified its reputation. Among critics and audiences, it stopped being just a drama about borstal life. It became an anti-establishment statement, a middle finger to the idea that certain truths should be softened for public consumption. Years later, when Scum finally did get its official release, it was hailed as a raw, uncompromising piece of social commentary. Performances, particularly Ray Winstone's, as the new arrival forced to navigate the violent hierarchy, were lauded for their authenticity. The thing about Scum is that it never lets the audience get comfortable. Every frame feels like a documentary you weren't supposed to see, a view behind locked doors that was never meant to reach the public. And that's exactly why it scared broadcasters back then, and why it still has the power to unsettle today. The Exorcist, 1973. Yes, The Exorcist was American-made, but its journey through Britain was anything but ordinary. After a hugely successful cinema run in the 1970s, it moved to the booming home video market in the early 80s, right as the UK was in full moral panic over so-called video nasties. Technically, The Exorcist was never prosecuted under that label, but the climate was hostile enough that local councils and moral watchdogs leaned hard on distributors. The result? It was quietly withdrawn from shelves. For more than a decade, you couldn't legally buy or rent it anywhere in Britain. The disappearance only deepened its mystique. Rumors swirled, stories of viewers fainting, screenings interrupted by ambulances, priests being called to cinemas. Long queues outside theaters during its original run took on a mythical glow in hindsight. Without any way to rewatch it at home, memories blurred into folklore, each retelling more dramatic than the last. By the time it returned uncut in the late 90s, a whole generation had grown up hearing about it without ever seeing a frame. Many were surprised, even baffled, to find much of the film was slow burn, methodical, almost restrained between its shocking moments. But that's the trick bands can play. When something is forbidden, your imagination fills the gaps with horrors more vivid than reality. In Britain, The Exorcist became the ultimate example of how a film's reputation can eclipse its actual content. The fear wasn't just on screen, it lived in whispered playground, conversations and tabloid headlines, in the hush that fell when someone claimed they'd actually seen it. Sometimes the scariest thing about a movie isn't the movie itself, but the legend it builds when no one can get their hands on it. Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. When Cannibal Holocaust first made its way toward British shores, it carried a reputation so toxic that even seasoned horror fans hesitated. Shot to look like recovered documentary footage from a lost expedition in the Amazon, it blurred the line between fiction and reality in a way few films had attempted before. Its grainy, handheld camera work and unpolished performances created the illusion of authenticity, which quickly became its biggest problem. Animal cruelty scenes were shown without cutaways, and although staged within the context of the film, they were real enough to earn the fury of the British Board of Film Censors. The verdict was swift. It was not to be released in the UK in any form. Its name landed squarely on the now infamous Video Nasties list, and owning or distributing it risked legal action. That only added to its legend. Collectors traded bootleg copies like rare artifacts, often as much for the bragging rights as the viewing experience. Ironically, the film contained a clear critique of exploitation in media, suggesting that the real villains weren't the so-called savages, but the documentary crew exploiting them for shocking footage. That nuance was lost in the noise of its controversy. In the decades that followed, Cannibal Holocaust became both a cautionary tale and a badge of honor for horror completists. When it finally surfaced in the UK, still cut for certain scenes, it had already lived a second life as a myth, a movie that people discussed in dark corners rather than in public cinema listings. It remains one of the most famous examples of how banning a film can elevate it to untouchable cult status, turning celluloid into legend. Crash 1996. David Cronenberg's Crash wasn't the kind of movie that crept up on you. It announced itself with a chilly, unsettling tone from the opening frame. Adapted from J.G. Ballard's novel, it explored the strange intersection between technology, danger, and human fascination with the aftermath of car accidents. There was no moral guidepost, no safe character to anchor the audience. It was presented with the same detached precision as a lab report, and that made it all the more disturbing to those who saw it. When the film reached Britain, the controversy hit before the public did. Westminster City Council flat out refused to let it screen in London's West End, citing concerns about public decency and potential influence on impressionable viewers. Other local councils followed suit, creating a patchwork of bans across the country. The strange part? The more certain places refused to show it, the more other audiences went out of their way to track it down. Critics were polarized. Some hailed it as an unflinching piece of art that confronted uncomfortable truths about obsession and modern alienation. Others dismissed it as pointless provocation. But what made Crash a censorship landmark wasn't just the content. It was the way the British bans revealed how local authorities could still make or break a film's release in the mid-90s. Today, the film sits in that gray zone where people either respect it for its daring vision or avoid it entirely. For those who remember the uproar, Crash is less about its story and more about the power of cultural gatekeeping, proof that sometimes the reaction to a movie becomes more historic than the movie itself. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Here's the thing about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It doesn't actually show as much as people think. The violence is mostly suggested, quick cuts, eerie sound design, and a sweaty, sun-baked atmosphere that makes you feel like you're trapped in the same nightmare as the characters. But when it arrived in Britain, none of that mattered to certain local councils. They saw the title, the tone, and the press coverage, and decided it was simply too much for their communities. While the BBFC didn't give it a national ban, the British system allowed local councils to override that and refuse exhibition within their jurisdiction. The result was a patchwork censorship map, where in some towns you could watch it, and in others you couldn't. For over 2 decades, that odd status turned it into a rite of passage for horror fans. People would literally travel across county lines to find a screening. By the time the ban was lifted in the late 90s, the legend had far outgrown the reality. Younger viewers, primed by years of myth, were shocked at how restrained it was compared to modern horror. Yet its power remained, not because of gore, but because of its claustrophobic energy and relentless pace. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre story, in Britain, is a perfect example of how the fear of a film can be more potent than the film itself. Tell people they can't have something, and they'll want it twice as much, especially if it comes wrapped in an aura of danger and rebellion. The Last House on the Left, 1972. From its shaky camera work to its unpredictable tone, The Last House on the Left never played by the usual horror rules. It was cheap, rough-edged, and unpolished, which only made it feel more dangerous to audiences in the early 70s. In Britain, that rawness was exactly what censors latched onto when they refused it a certificate for cinema release. Its eventual arrival on home video during the 80s coincided with the Video Nasties crackdown, and it was quickly swept up in the list of banned titles. Even heavily cut versions struggled to make it through the BBFC. Owning an unapproved copy became a small act of rebellion for horror collectors. For decades, The Last House on the Left existed more in conversation than in actual viewing. People traded. Stories about its extremes often exaggerated in the telling. When the uncut version finally got an official UK release in the 2000s, some found it dated, others found it still unsettling, but everyone agreed that its long absence had shaped its identity. The irony? Its creators had intended it partly as a cautionary tale. Instead, it became famous as forbidden fruit. In Britain, The Last House on the Left will always be remembered as one of the prime examples of how moral panic can turn a scrappy, low-budget film into a cultural lightning rod. I Spit on Your Grave, 1978. By the time I Spit on Your Grave arrived in the UK, it was already carrying a reputation from abroad as one of the most brutal revenge thrillers ever made. The BBFC took one look and said absolutely not. It was refused classification outright, meaning no legal cinema screenings, no home video, nothing. The film's grainy, unpolished style made it feel uncomfortably real, and that rawness unnerved censors as much as the plot itself. It landed on the video nasties list, and for years, having a copy in your possession was a legal risk. But as with so many banned films, the scarcity only fed demand. Bootleg VHS tapes were passed around like contraband, complete with whispered warnings about how intense it really was. The official stance didn't soften much over time, even when the BBFC eventually considered a release decades later. It came with heavy edits, stripping out minutes of footage. Uncut versions were only available through imports, making them prized items in horror collections. When the full version finally became legally available in the 21st century, it split opinion. Some argued that without the censorship baggage, it didn't pack the same dangerous aura. Others insisted it was still one of the most uncompromising revenge stories ever put to film. In Britain's censorship history, I Spit on Your Grave remains a classic example of the paradox. If you want to make sure a film becomes legendary among hardcore fans, try banning it completely. It might vanish from shop shelves, but it will live forever in whispered conversations and late-night bootleg screenings. The Human Centipede 2 full sequence, 2011. You'd think the BBFC had seen it all by the 2010s, but then along came The Human Centipede 2. The first film had already tested the limits of audience tolerance, but this sequel dialed up its grotesque concept in ways the board deemed beyond classification. Their initial decision? An outright ban. What made it different from older cases was that this was a modern film, and the ban instantly became worldwide news. The director defended it as deliberately over the top, a piece of extreme cinema meant to shock, but the UK's initial refusal to pass, it only heightened curiosity. After a storm of headlines, a heavily cut version was eventually allowed into British cinemas, with more than 2 minutes of footage removed. By then, the damage, or the marketing, depending on your view, had been done. People who would never have noticed it before suddenly wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Like other banned films before it, The Human Centipede 2 thrived on its notoriety. Whether people found it grotesque, absurd, or darkly funny, it proved that even in an era of on-demand streaming and instant imports, the words banned in the UK still have the power to make headlines. The War Game, 1966. In the mid-1960s, Britain was living under the shadow of the Cold War. Nuclear weapons were no longer just headlines. They were an ever-present invisible threat. Into that tense atmosphere came The War Game, a BBC-produced docudrama directed by Peter Watkins. Shot in stark black and white, it blended fictional scenarios with a documentary style so convincing that it felt like watching a real broadcast from the end of the world. The film depicted the aftermath of a nuclear attack on Britain with unflinching realism, firestorms ripping through cities, mass evacuations collapsing into chaos, and survivors facing hunger, disease, and despair. Watkins used non-professional actors, authentic locations, and factual military and medical data to ground every scene in reality. It was designed not to entertain, but to jolt the audience awake. The BBC initially commissioned The War Game for television, but once executives saw the finished product, they panicked. Declaring it too horrifying for the medium of broadcasting, they shelved it indefinitely. The official line was that it might be too distressing for audiences, but many suspected political pressure played a role. The government of the day had little interest in airing a film that made the nation's nuclear defense policy look both inadequate and catastrophic. For nearly 2 decades, the war game existed in limbo. It wasn't shown on British television until 1985, long after it had already won an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature and screened internationally. By then, it had become a symbol of the fight against censorship, proof that even public broadcasters could bury their own work if it hit too close to home. In British film history, the war game stands as a rare case where banning a film didn't just give it notoriety, it amplified its credibility, making it a warning from the past that still feels uncomfortably relevant today. Love Camp 7, 1969. One of the earliest entries in the so-called women in prison subgenre, Love Camp 7 arrived long before the grindhouse boom of the 70s hit its peak. Made in 1969, it blended the rough edges of low-budget filmmaking with a pulp fiction-style premise, designed purely to shock and provoke. But in Britain, the film's reputation didn't come from its content being widely seen. It came from the fact that almost nobody could see it at all. The British Board of Film Censors took a hard line from the outset. They refused it a certificate under the UK's obscenity laws, placing it in a category of films deemed beyond saving. This wasn't a case where a few edits could make it acceptable. In the BBFC's eyes, Love Camp 7 was irredeemable, a title destined for the banned list, alongside other works considered culturally toxic at the time. Over the years, that refusal gave it an odd kind of second life. Collectors sought it out not because they believed it was an overlooked masterpiece, but because it was forbidden. In the underground tape-trading world of the 1980s and 1990s, its name regularly appeared on banned list flyers, often alongside far more famous titles. Owning a copy, usually a fuzzy bootleg imported from overseas, became more about bragging rights than cinematic appreciation. When it finally scraped its way to a legal UK release decades later, the reaction was muted. Stripped of its mystery and placed in plain view, it was largely regarded as a relic of a different era in exploitation cinema. Still, its place in British censorship history remains secure. Love Camp 7 is proof that a ban doesn't require a large audience to create a legacy. Sometimes, the myth of a film is more powerful than the film itself. Women in Cellblock 9, 1978. By the late 1970s, European exploitation cinema had burned through just about every setting and premise imaginable, from exotic islands to gritty urban streets. But Women in Cellblock 9 pushed things into the bleak confines of a prison camp backdrop. Shot on a shoestring budget and dripping with the hallmarks of grindhouse filmmaking, it was never intended to be subtle. Its unfiltered style was designed to shock, but in Britain, it never got the chance. When the film reached the UK, the British Board of Film Censors took one look and issued the harshest verdict in their arsenal: outright refusal of a certificate under the country's obscenity laws. There were no discussions about trimming scenes, no proposed edits, no compromise whatsoever. It was banned in total, locked out of British cinemas, video shops, and television. Of course, history shows what happens when you tell people they can't have something. The ban only amplified the curiosity. In collector circles, Women in Cellblock 9 became a whispered title, often mentioned alongside other notorious, forbidden films. Copies, usually imported VHS tapes or grainy bootlegs, floated around at swap meets and through mail-order catalogs, their low-quality picture adding to the sense that you were watching something illicit. Decades later, when streaming platforms and global imports made it easier to see almost any film, Women in Cellblock 9 finally became accessible to a wider audience. But by then, its shock value had faded, and much of its underground mystique had evaporated. Even so, it holds a place in British censorship history as a prime example of the no negotiation and bans once handed down without hesitation. These days, such absolute refusals are rare, but the memory of them lingers, a reminder that the surest way to make a cult classic is to keep it out of sight entirely. 15 films, 15 battles with the censor's pen, and proof that banning a movie often makes it immortal. Some pushed boundaries, others just pushed the wrong buttons, but all left their mark. Which do you think went too far? Comment below, share this list, and subscribe for more untold stories from cinema's most controversial corners.